Good morning again, everyone, and thank you for bearing with us while we got started. I see that a number of our participants have joined us already for this morning's webinar on climate change and its effects in a multi-hazard environment. So without further ado, my name is Kellen Sanka. I'm the Training and Education Officer at the Office of Disaster Preparedness and Management, the ODPM, and I will be your host for this morning's webinar. Today, we'll be discussing climate change, which is particularly dangerous for small island developing states such as Trinidad and Tobago because it can exacerbate specific natural hazards such as tropical storms, floods, and droughts. States such as ours are particularly vulnerable to these types of disasters due to our small size and our resources. Now, as global temperatures rise, the frequency and severity of these hazards are likely to increase, which can have really devastating consequences for islands such as ours. Now, I won't go into any more detail because we have a very packed panel this morning, and I'll allow our panel to give you all the information as we go ahead. So as we get into things, I would just like to remind or make persons aware of a few of our rules this morning. We're asking all persons to please keep your microphones turned off when you're not speaking, as there can be some background noise, and we want to limit the noise as much as possible. Persons are invited to raise their hand to get my attention before speaking as well, and I'll call on you. Of course, there's the question and answer feature that's built into Zoom as well. So, of course, if you have any questions, feel free to enter them there and we'll address them to the appropriate panelist. And lastly, as always, we're just asking everyone to be respectful of each other when speaking throughout the entire session. This is the first webinar for this year's National Disaster Prevention and Preparedness Month, the theme for which is being disaster ready is my responsibility. So that's one thing we want to take away from today's session, how we lean into our personal responsibility for being disaster ready. And for our panel this morning, we have our representative from the Trinidad and Tobago Meteorological Service, Ms. Carol Subrat Ali, and followed by our representative from the Ministry of Planning and Development, Mr. Kishan Kumar Singh. Dr. Ronald Rupnarayan will follow from the University of the West Indies, and then Ms. Catherine Badlu Durga from the Ministry of Works and Transport. And we'll round out today's session with a presentation from Ms. Kamira Gulston of the ODPM. And to close, we'll have a quick discussion, and that'll be our session for this morning. Of course, we'll be fielding questions after each session, after each speaker has given their presentation. So, like I said before, if you have any questions that you'd like to ask our panelists this morning, feel free to share them with us and we'll address them as appropriately. So without any further ado, please allow me to introduce Ms. Carol Subrat Ali, Senior Meteorologist at the Met Office. And Ms. Subrat Ali has majored in meteorology and mathematics at the University of the West Indies. At Cave Hill, Barbados, she holds a postgraduate degree in coastal engineering and management from the University of the West Indies, St. Augustine, and Ms. Subrat Ali has also trained on wave flume operations at the University College of London, and she's now initiating the Marine Services Unit at the TTMS. Good morning, Ms. Subrat Ali. Happy to have you with us this morning.
Hi, good morning. Thank you so much for the introduction. It's great to be here.
I'm going to stop sharing so you can share your presentation with us.
Okay, can you give me an affirmative on that, please?
Yes, we're seeing you. Everything's clear on your slides.
Full screen?
Feel free to proceed. Yeah, full screen.
Great. Thank you so much. So thanks again. In this first session, we're going to focus on hydrometeorological impacts in Trinidad and Tobago, and we're looking at a subset of a multi-hazard sphere. We are not going to be, oops. We're not going to be examining all the hydromet hazards here, but we're going to focus on two very common hazards which have a higher probability of occurrence with mostly moderate impacts, and these are rainfall and strong winds. And in some cases, we can have severe impacts out of these, but we also focus on two hazards with a lower frequency of occurrence, but can also have severe impact. And these are lightning and storm surge. So one of our most common impacts of heavy rainfall is flooding, and there are different categories of flooding in Trinidad and Tobago. We have localized flooding, or what we call ponding, and these occur in specific areas. Riverine flooding, and these are specific to riverbank breaches. They occur in river basins, and the surrounding communities tend to be, of course, most affected. We have widespread flooding, and we look here at countrywide areas. Flash flooding, and this is so very commonly misrepresented. Flash flooding is a type of flooding that happens very suddenly. So more often than not, we tend to see reports of flash flooding across the country, and it is categorized very wrongly. We also have coastal flooding, and this is site-specific to coastal areas. Now, within recent time, we've had some really horrible flood events. For example, we had the Greenvale 2018, which was described as the mother of all floods. If you look at the background of this particular image, you can see that the water level is not just contained within the first property, but it was widespread within the community. We also have other impacts from heavy rainfall, one of those being landslides, which are very prevalent in Trinidad, especially along the northern range, but in Tobago as well. Again, within recent times, there seems to be many more reports as we have above normal rainfall persisting. The coasts have also not got away. Anomalous rainfall in 2022 enabled a second event for coastal flooding on the East Coast. And this was a major event that had enormous infrastructural damage. And this was due to consistent runoff from persistent rainfall. The impacts, in addition to infrastructural and property damage, include also, unfortunately, loss of human life, which is what we may consider to be the most significant impact. And we mentioned infrastructural damages, but we also have road closures and lack of full access to roadways, erosion, crop destruction, livestock loss, threats to aquatic species and also coastal environments. And you just saw the Ina River area being affected there. Health risks due to contaminated water, displaced housing, as well as other economic impacts. So to get this anomalous rainfall, two key events are needed. And this is high humidity and heat. So the higher the temperature, the more water vapor can be held in the atmosphere. And within the ocean environment where we live, we are in an island. There's therefore potentially an infinite amount of water to evaporate in the air. But of course, the atmosphere can't hold more than 100%. When we get to high humidity, we get sometimes torrential rainfall. So therefore, there's a link between rainfall intensity and increasing temperatures. And if you look at the graph here with the global mean temperatures, the trend is an upward trend. And if you then refer this back to climate change, you have increased temperatures, and therefore automatically you have an increased source of heat, which can then aid convection. So we've looked at rainfall a bit. We now look at another hazard, strong winds. And damaging winds are inherently, yes, associated with tropical cyclones. But also wind surges can happen with non-tropical cyclone events, such as in the case of the September 3rd, 2021 event, where Trinidad was impacted on a nationwide scale. And this is one of the major factors in very quick damage across the country. Lightning is yet another hazard associated with a lower frequency of adverse impacts, but which can in fact cause severe impacts. There have been recent instances of lightning storms, both in Trinidad and Tobago, and while thankfully fatalities were not in the list, or at least none that we were aware of, infrastructural damage was. We had a blackout as a lightning storm swept across Trinidad and Tobago, and we have 2 instances here in 2019 and 2020. And while we hear the Met Services, we get reports. These are all not listed here, but I've just given you 2 as an example. We have unfortunately had reports of people being struck while attending to electricity poles, for example. So it's something that we tend to not really pay too much attention to, but it is in fact one of those very important hazards that we must consider. And as we get further down into the presentation, there's a little bit more on lightning. Storm surges. Now, storm surges mentioned here, although it is not a very common occurrence in our area, simply because of our geographical position and latitude, it's taken for granted a bit that we are not going to have storm surge. But I'd just like to point out that it is in fact one of those very, very dangerous hazards because of the quick instance in which it happens. A storm surge would just move into the coast, and then you have water just all around. And 1 cubic yard of water weighs almost a ton. So that 1 foot of deep storm surge can sweep your car off. And even 6 inches may be very, very difficult to stand and to be able to move around in. And I'd like to point your attention to the vehicles here that got caught up in storm surge. If you are caught in a storm surge, be it in Trinidad or anywhere else, please do not try to open your doors. You're literally trying to push against 1 ton. So the best way to do this is to get the back seats down and get through the trunk. And if you look at the photo, you can actually see some of the trunks are actually popped open here. So these several hydrometeorological hazard impacts can come from 1 cloud type. And it's called a cumulonimbus cloud. And these clouds may exist as a single cloud. There may be several cumulonimbus together, and we call that a squall line. Or we may have a cumulonimbus cluster, such as with the case of a tropical depression, or it may be well organized with a spiral banding cloud fields, for example, in a hurricane. So if we look at a cumulonimbus in a little bit more detail, because these are going to be mainstays of our rainy season / hurricane season as we get into it come June. These clouds are the only ones that are capable of extending throughout the entirety of the entire atmosphere. They produce lightning, and I showed you before, lightning is in fact dangerous for us here. But I'd like to point out that top left photo, where you should never stand under a tree or shelter under a tree during a lightning storm. They carry about 3 million volts. In electricity lines, it's a lot less than that. They are capable of producing hail, and we have events in Trinidad that we've recorded where we did have hail, and I have some of them listed here for you. Perhaps not the golf ball size hail, but certainly we did have reports. We have very, very damaging winds due to the downdrafts out of these systems. And they form in an area of strong instability. You can even see funnel clouds, and funnel clouds they look exactly like that, a funnel that does not touch the ground. We've had reports here, of course, again in Trinidad, of funnel clouds. It shows areas of instability and potential cumulonimbus clouds, water spouts, and these are funnels that actually touch the water surface. We've had several reports in the Gulf of Paria, especially for water spouts and tornadoes. These are funnels that touch the ground over land. Identifying a mature thundercloud, and it is in your best interest to be able to spot these clouds. They are mushroom shaped, they have an anvil top, very towering, ominous looking, and often accompanied by lightning. And if you're close enough, you can hear the thunder and strong downdrafts. The shape is your key to noticing a thundercloud. So they sort of mushroom out at the top, and at the bottom, there's very heavy precipitation. So I'm going to let you see if you can identify the thunderclouds here. It's a little bit of an interactive session, but because of time, I would just let you look at it, and then I'll point you in the right direction. So you're looking for a mushroom type cloud or a very ominous base. And so if you have picked A, D, G, you clearly see that mushroom type cloud there, the ominous base in B. And D is, you can't see the shape, but there's a hint there that it's a thundercloud, and that's your lightning. So thunderclouds are very frequent during the rainy season. We can also have them during dry season as well. But once you spot a thundercloud or a line of thunderclouds moving in, watch out. More than likely, you're going to have very adverse weather. Rainy season, just to remind you, is from June to December, and the subset of that is hurricane season from June to November. The general outlook for the entire Atlantic is that we expect for 2023, 13 named storms and 2 major hurricanes. Anticipated 2023 hurricane basin is slightly below average activity. This forecast, this outlook is from the Colorado State University. The TTMS is in the current state of developing the outlook for our area. So we look forward to that from the climate section. And finally, just to remind you that we have our CAP compliant hydromet early warning system available, where once we deem that there can be impactful weather, we let the public know via our early warning system. And these are available on our website and all our social media platforms. Great, and I think I've done it in the nick of time. And if you have any questions, I would be happy to entertain.
Thank you so much, Ms. Subrat Ali. We actually do have a question from one of our participants regarding if it is that you would be willing to share your slides. It seems that these slides are very much appreciated by our audience this morning. Okay, great. Sure, no problem. I will pass this on to the ODPM personnel so they can be distributed. All right, no problem. Persons are invited to reach out via email if it is that you would like slides from Ms. Subrat Ali, so we can have them sent to you today. Now, the floor is open for questions, as we would have mentioned before. And I note that in our Q&A, we have some questions here. So, Carol, if you don't mind, one of the questions is any of the data from the WRA or Met Office related to rainfall from gauges available over the range of years to show the degree of progression? Okay, and the answer is yes, the data is most certainly available, but unfortunately I can only speak on behalf of the TTMS. If you would like to have gauge data from the WRA, I would suggest you contact them, but I can also direct you to our website. If you go into observations, there's a wealth of data freely available and instantly available there right now. All right, thank you very much. So persons, as you've heard, you can go to the Met Office's website to get the available data that's uploaded for the public. You can also write to them and the Water Resource Agency, the WRA, for their data regarding rainfall. There's another question in here regarding hail, and it's noted that hail has been experienced in Trinidad, and they're wondering how exactly is that possible?
Okay, so that's going to take me to a wee bit of a technical discussion. But okay, let's do it. So the cumulonimbus cloud is able to get to very, very high heights within the atmosphere, well above the freezing level. Within the cloud, you have a process of glaciation where water droplets will accrete and they freeze and they would melt and they would freeze again, and they get caught up between the updrafts and downdrafts within the cloud. Now, one of the more important things here is that the downdrafts, the downward flowing winds within the cloud, sometimes they're so strong that they take this ice mass and they deposit them towards the ground. But because of the speed at which it happens, those particles are not able to fully melt, and so they get deposited as ice pieces. And that's what happens in our area. But because we are tropical, there's perhaps a lot more melting than if we were in a temperate zone. And that is why we don't get large hail, but we still can get hail. I hope that answers the question.
I think so. Thank you for that very comprehensive answer. Much appreciated. We're just going to take about 2 more questions and then we'll move on. And if we have some time, we'll come back to some of the others. One of the questions is that due to our geographical location, the geographical location of Trinidad and Tobago, is it still possible that Trinidad could be impacted by a hurricane? I'm guessing because we've seen that upward trend in the movement of hurricanes.
And the answer is yes. We've actually been impacted by hurricanes and tropical storms in the past. We tend to find that these systems that develop at very low latitudes, those are the ones that come across and affect us the most. Generally speaking, within the Atlantic belt east of us, systems that form or that develop rather north of our latitudes, those are the ones that tend to move on and are affected more by the Coriolis effect, and so they tend to track north of us. So the answer is yes, we have been and we still can be affected by tropical cyclones.
All right, thank you so much. And our last question for you this morning, Carol, what are the upcoming steps in terms of data collection and long-term modeling of climate change and microclimates around Trinidad and Tobago?
Okay, so I believe that question would be best answered by our climate section. So perhaps we can do a follow-up on that one. I know that there is some move towards climate modeling now. However, I am not the current climatologist. I'm the chief meteorologist at the TTMS. So I can get some information, pass the question on, and then we can facilitate an answer.
Oh, I see a hand raised by Mr. Oscar Lovell. Mr. Lovell?
Yes, good morning. Morning to everyone. So just wanted to chime in on that last question. That we can point persons as well to the Met Service website, where there is some bit of analysis that is presented. So someone can visit our website, metoffice.gov.tt. If you click on the climate tab, you will find a little header called climate. You click on that. There is some information there, some analysis, some projections that have also been done for Trinidad by the climate department that gives, to some extent, outlooks. It is not comprehensive, but if someone wishes to get a more detailed analysis, it can be done if you were to write to the Met Service. But there is some information that is presented on our website under the climate tab. You will see some analysis in terms of projections with respects to rainfall, with respects to temperature outlooks, and so on for Trinidad. So I just wanted to share that information.
Thank you very much, Mr. Lovell, and thank you again very much Ms. Subrat Ali, I saw you've taken us to the Met Office's page, so we can see exactly where it is we have to go to get that information right there at the climate tab. Thank you again so much for that. So for our questions that were asked, I hope that they were answered sufficiently. I know that there were one or two we couldn't get to in this session, but we'll try to address them before we wrap up today. All right. Thanks again, Ms. Subrat Ali. And with that, I think we'll be moving right along to our next presenter of the morning. Mr. Kishan Kumar Singh, the head of the multilateral unit at the Ministry of Planning, and he's head of environmental agreements at the ministry. He's also the lead climate negotiator for Trinidad and Tobago since 1998. He's the chair of the expert group on technology transfer under the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change from 2004-2005, and he's championed and contributed the development of methodology for doing technology needs assessments for adaptation. He's actually co-authored the initial handbook on technology needs assessment for the UNDP. Good morning, Mr. Kumar Singh. Happy to have you with us this morning.
Good morning, and thank you. Thank you to the ODPM for allowing me this opportunity to share my thoughts on what I think is a very important conversation that has been happened but needs to be continued and put in the context that you have framed this webinar, and that is one of climate change in a multi-hazard environment. And when we hear about, hazards and climate hazards, as the last speaker excellently pointed out, we think about storms, we think about roofs being blown out, we think about heavy rain, we think about floods and so on. But I just want to take maybe a complementary slant to that, and that is what climate change is about, because climate change in itself is a hazard, and a very severe one at that. And why do I say that? Is because we are now experiencing the adverse impacts of climate change worldwide. It's no longer ahead of us. It's upon us. We are seeing the effects right here in Trinidad and Tobago. Forgive me if my internet is spotty. I'm not in the country. I'm actually out, and that's why my video is off. So apologies for that. So we all know, and since this is a public lecture, I'll keep it as non-technical as possible, but in a comprehensive way. Climate change has been caused by, or is attributed to be caused in the contemporary sense by the emissions of increasing greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, largely caused by the combustion of fossil fuels for energy, which gives rise to greenhouse gases such as carbon dioxide, nitrous oxide, methane, and so on. Now, climate change in itself is not bad, and the climate has changed for millions of years over time, and it's a natural occurring phenomenon. So what is so different about it now, and why is it being paid so much global attention? And the reason, of course, is the rate at which it is changing as a result of these human-induced activities and the large amount of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere that are being pumped by human activity. Greenhouse gases themselves are not bad. In fact, without them, the naturally occurring ones such as carbon dioxide and oxides of nitrogen and methane and so on, if it weren't for the greenhouse gases, which have heat trapping potential, the Earth would have been much, much colder and in fact unlivable. There would have been no life on Earth. And so the natural greenhouse effect, or the natural warming effect of these gases, actually maintain the Earth at a particular temperature that gives rise to it being conducive to life as we know it. What is the issue now is the rate at which these greenhouse gases are being increased in the atmosphere through man's activity, like I said, fossil fuel combustion and so on, agriculture in one sense, waste and so on, deforestation. And the more greenhouse gases you have in the atmosphere, the more heat trapping potential you have. And the more heat trapping potential you have, then you give rise to global warming and the increase in the ambient temperature of the atmosphere. And what this does is that the extra heat is dissipated in many ways. Some of it is absorbed in the ocean. More than 90% actually is absorbed in the ocean. and some of it dissipated through the climate system. Hence, we get the name climate change. So the impacts of climate change are now being felt. It has been identified as an issue long time ago, many years ago, and world governments decided to come together with scientists or acting on scientific evidence and advice to devise approaches to basically address this global issue, because once greenhouse gases go in the atmosphere, it does not belong to any country. It is added to what is known as the global commons. And therefore, every country has a responsibility for managing and addressing climate change from that perspective. And so most recently in 2015, the world governments adopted the Paris Agreement, which you probably know about, which sets out a temperature goal, which is to maintain or to constrict or to constrain temperature increases to 1.5 degrees above pre-industrial levels when greenhouse gases started to be emitted in the atmosphere. I'd like to note that the rate of which climate change is now happening has been flagged as a dire warning to humanity by the UN Secretary General and by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which is a scientific advisory body to the UN on climate change, which says now that the rate at which this is happening will see us at temperature increases to between 3 and 4 degrees by the end of the century, bearing in mind that we are already at 1.1 to 1.15 degrees as we currently stand. And the temperature is expected to rise to 1.5 degrees within the next decade and a half to 2 decades. So within the lifetimes of most of us, and certainly our children and grandchildren, we will be seeing temperature increases running away. Just to put this in perspective, and coming from an island state as well, coral reefs, as we know them, are very sensitive to temperature increases, and we have seen increases in ocean temperatures at a degree, at a 1.5 degree warming. We can expect about by about a maximum of 90%, between 80 and 90% of coral reefs being destroyed, and at a warming of 2 degrees, we can see virtually all of these coral reefs being destroyed, and that will have knock-on effects in terms of habitats for fish, food security, and so on. What we are experiencing now worldwide, we can see record levels of rivers being at its lowest point in history, 1,200 years and so on, in Europe, in North America, in China, and so on. What we're experiencing now as I speak is a rapid heating of the oceans, something that is now puzzling scientists as to why this is happening, notwithstanding that we are in a phase of what we call El Nino, La Nina. We are now coming out of La Nina and getting into an El Nino, projected to be a strong El Nino, but that does not account for why the ocean is warming at a current state. So we may be seeing this kind of chaotic climate happening, which cannot be modeled, and we got a question about modeling. And the reason why the climate is modeled is to project what these impacts could be, and therefore plan for them in terms of coping for them, like what we call adaptation. So the long-term impacts of climate change for small island states pose an existential threat. Really, its existence is in jeopardy. There are some islands in the South Pacific and atolls have already disappeared as a result of rising sea levels, which can come from the thermal expansion of seawater because it heats up, but more so from the melting of the cryosphere. Now, usually we thought that the ice in the cryosphere in cold countries is usually a cold country issue, but nearing the end of this century, or towards the end of this century, we can see that sea level rise arising from the melting of the glaciers will far outweigh the thermal expansion, reducing the influence of thermal expansion to about 10%. And with the abnormal warming of ocean temperatures, we expect to see that cryosphere being accelerated, the melting of the cryosphere being accelerated. What does all of this mean for small island states or Trinidad and Tobago? What we have seen is, for example, the weather extremes, which is part of the normal climate variability, manifesting itself. We've heard that, because of climate change, we will see more and more extreme weather events, such as storms and hurricanes. And hurricanes and storms don't no longer form, east of us, off the west coast of Africa. It's forming anywhere, basically. If you remember Brett, the last time we got struck by a storm, or a storm threatened us at least, it formed basically over a 24 to 48 period, and it didn't originate off the coast of Africa. So we are seeing a bit of wild weather happening. For Trinidad and Tobago, the models project, the downscale models at the scale of islands project that we're going to see less and less precipitation. That will mean less rainfall over time, which will have implications for food security, for agriculture, for irrigation needs, for the cost of producing water, for potable water, and of course knock-on effects to human health and sanitation and so on, because the agricultural crops will be challenged, and the nutrition value, actually there was a recent papers that the nutrition value of some agricultural crops will be diminished as a result of increasing carbon dioxide levels in the atmosphere. So we see more acidic and arid soils leaching out nutrients and so on from the soil. So we can also expect that to have knock-on effects on human health. Drier temperatures, hotter temperatures will affect the elderly, the young, and so on, children and so on. We can also expect to see the frequency of return of these climate extremes, not storms and hurricanes, but the heavy precipitation, because the models predict that we are going to see more and more intense rainfall. And we are seeing that these were models that were done 20 years ago, and we're actually seeing that now because of rising temperatures, more increasing evapotranspiration. What goes up must come down, and if more goes up, more will come down in less time. And we are seeing that in the flooding data, the meteorological data from the last presentation. The intensity is increasing, and the frequency at which these extremes are happening will increase. In other words, the return period are going to increase, or the periods are going to increase. So, for example, in my own lifetime, I remember in the early 70s, the Manzanilla Mayaro Road being washed away as a result of the natural flow of the River Swamp. It happened again in 2014, and it happened just recently again. And so, if we addressing climate change is not only about planning for adaptation, in take into account the impacts, but it's also about building back better after an extreme weather event. So if they build the road back in Mayaro, Manzanilla, and I keep saying this, if they build it back the same way, it's going to be washed away again, and again, and again, and again, unless climate change impacts and climate risk assessments are taken into account into the engineering designs for hard infrastructure, for example. What is also required is for planning for climate change through building resilience. And it is not about planning for adapting to the long-term climate change for the long term, because that trajectory is constantly changing. That goalpost is changing. So we don't know against what temperature increase we can plan for the impacts, for example. As I said, the Paris Agreement aims at 1.5 to 2 degrees. We are already at 1.15, I think, expected to reach 1.5 within the next 2 decades, and between 3 and 4 at the current rate of climate change by the end of the century. So our approach has been, from a policy perspective, to integrate climate risk assessments into sectoral planning through what is called a pathways approach. So we assess the climate risks, the climate variability, and the climate extremes impacts, and what they will have on sectors and their cross-sectoral impacts, design intervention options, and when the risks or the extremes manifest themselves again, you have an opportunity to monitor, to evaluate the efficacy of the inputs, and therefore redesign going forward. So it's a bit of an iterative forward trajectory with long-term adaptation in mind through building climate resiliency in all the sectors. And I think this is this is one of the ways in which these hazards, these extreme hazards, can actually be buffered by building more climate resiliency into systems, not only biophysical systems, but socioeconomic systems or human systems, including those that the energy sector, those that earn GDP for us and foreign exchange. So while I want to endorse the need to address these extreme events, such as storms and hurricanes, we usually focus or place the focus too much on these weather events because they manifest themselves in the ways that the last presenter showed, including loss of life and so on. But the real hazard is the slow onset impacts of climate change. The ones that we don't usually see, manifested as flooding, but will creep up on us, as we are seeing globally, in terms of decreased precipitation, decreased water availability, decreased crop production, and so on. And it's not only about the impacts in Trinidad and Tobago, because we are large food importer as well. So climate change impacts on countries from which we import food will also affect food and nutrition in Trinidad and Tobago, because we'll have to address issues such as affordability, such as accessibility, such as availability, because these food products might not necessarily be available for us to buy in the first place. So there's a whole lot of interlinkages between the individual impacts of climate change in sectors that need to be put together to form the holistic picture, both from a biophysical perspective as well as from a socioeconomic perspective, so as to build the resilience that will allow us to meet the challenges going forward. Of course, the way to do this as well is for the world to reduce emissions in the long term, to allow us to maintain that trajectory to 1.5. But because of how climate change is and how these increasing concentrations of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere manifest as temperature increases, it takes about 7 decades or so, 70 years. So if the world were to shut down now and no more greenhouse gases are to be pumped into the atmosphere, we are still committed to a change in climate because of past emissions. So we have to plan for that, because this in itself are hazards that are multifaceted and will take the shape and the impacts in many, many myriad ways, and for which we have to plan. So I just want to sort of juxtapose the slow onset climate impacts that will creep up on us, that is already here, and some of it is being manifested in extreme events, against the sort of hazards that we see during rainfall, for example, or floods or droughts and so on. So I think that's it for my 15 minutes. Thank you very much. I'm happy to take any questions.
Mr. Kumar Singh, thank you so much for that very, very comprehensive presentation. I do want to go straight to our questions that were sent in. And to begin with, someone else is asking about slides could be shared. And yes, we can arrange for slides to be shared. We're simply asking for persons to contact the ODPM via our public email address, and that is publicinfo.odpm@gmail.com. And we'll respond to those emails with the slides that persons are requesting from today's session. But on to questions specifically for you, Mr. Kumar Singh. I see one here, and it goes, are we seeing the cumulative effects, such as the overall warming of the oceans, such that warming is faster, and as a result, we are getting unprecedented manifestations of climate change?
The short answer is possibly. I made reference to the rapid warming of the oceans that is occurring now as I speak, and that is worrying scientists. Albeit that we are entering an El Nino or an anomalous warming of the Pacific. Now there's no scientific reason why this rate of ocean warming should happen, because of the large capacity of the oceans to absorb heat. Like I said, it absorbs about 90% of the solar radiation, about 10% of the carbon dioxide. So the oceans are really a repository. Of course, when this happens, it means then that more heat is available from the oceans to the atmosphere. So we can perhaps in the short term, very short term, see spikes in in atmospheric temperatures as well. So, scientists are very wary to make definitive conclusions about what is happening. But what we know is happening is that we are seeing climate variability at a scale that we have never seen before, and that climate change and global warming can possibly be a factor into some of these observations that are being made. So the short answer is highly possible.
All right, thank you very much. One more question, and with regard to the warming of water masses, have researchers seen any changes in bacterial or fungal growth that can lead to an increase in diseases, perhaps even diseases we may not have encountered before?
Well, I don't do direct research, but my own sort of reading suggests that climate change, because it will also result in higher levels of humidity and temperature, which can form conducive habitats for microorganisms and pathogens, both in the atmosphere and in coastal waters. That is also something that has been documented. So we can see, for example, pathogens that attack coral reefs because of higher ocean temperatures may tend to proliferate and cause coral bleaching events, as we have seen in the past. The frequency or the episodes of these events have perhaps not been enough to make a correlation, but the climate projections of increasing humidity, of increasing temperature, which can provide the conducive habitats for these pathogens and microorganisms, have been modeled, and these are some of the projected impacts in terms of the spread of vector-borne diseases, of airborne diseases, and so on. But I guess the jury is still out, subject to continuous observations and research by relevant scientists. Thank you.
All right, thank you very, very much, Mr. Kumar Singh, for a very comprehensive question and some very comprehensive answers right here for us live. I sincerely appreciate you taking the time to be here with us today. And with that, I think we're going to move right along to our next panelist for today, Dr. Ronald Roopnarine of the University of the West Indies. Dr. Roopnarine is a lecturer in sustainable land and water management and disaster risk resilience. He's a researcher and academic with a thorough background in disaster risk resilience, sustainable land and water resource management, and presently he's a lecturer in the Faculty of Food and Agriculture at the UWI St. Augustine campus, where he's responsible for teaching and the development of courses related to agri-environmental disaster risk and climate resilience. He's also the network manager of Caribbean WaterNet, the Caribbean arm of the CAPNet under the UNDP, and he's a consultant for various international and regional developmental and state agencies. He has also served on a number of projects implemented by various UN agencies such as UN Water, the UN FAO, UN Environment, and the UNDP. And thus far, he has amassed significant experience in integrated water resources management, land management, and climate change adaptations, with specific focus on Caribbean small island developing states. Happy to have you with us this morning, Dr. Roopnarine.
Thank you very much, Chair, and good morning to all joining us in the various modalities. The first thing I would say before I share my presentation is that disaster management is not my responsibility. It's our responsibility. So I want to ensure that everybody grasps that this is something that is holistic and something that we all have to contribute to. So that being said, permit me to share my screen, right? Right, so I will focus a little bit more. My colleagues before would have presented very nicely on the dangers and the impacts and all the issues that we are expected to face because of climate change. And some of the information that was shared focused on the fact that you can face multiple hazards at the same time. And many times we always look at these things in silos. So I'm going to try to focus primarily on the fact that there could be multiple hazards that people or countries face simultaneously in terms of what we call compound hazards or cascading hazards. And we saw this very, very evident with COVID and, in Barbados and SVG with the volcanic eruption. And then even in Trinidad, due to extreme weather, we would have had flooding, etc. So that will be the focus of my presentation today. So as we go on, the first thing I want to say is that climate change has complex impacts. It is not as simple as you see. It's not just floods, it's not just droughts, it's not just hurricanes. You can have a series of impacts that lead to things like unpredictable rainfall patterns, shrinking of ice sheet, rising of sea levels, floods, and droughts. And in addition to that, you could also have other types of hazards. So you could have geophysical hazards in the form of earthquakes and volcanic eruptions that could occur simultaneously. Further to that, and as has been pointed out by some of my colleagues before, anthropogenic climate change, meaning that it's something that is caused by us, has increased, right? In terms of the observed precipitation, winds, extreme sea level events, and so on. We have evidence that these things have increased. And the idea is that there are persons who still do not believe in the concept of climate change entirely, because we are seemingly focusing on data that we would have collected for a certain period. And one may ask, well, what happened 200 years ago or 300 years ago? Perhaps this is cyclical. And I think it is more important for us to view these things as, as something that, you face challenges, you face impacts. There is no doubt as to whether or not we are having increased rainfall, we are having increased temperatures, we are having impacts that lead to extreme flooding and affect vulnerable communities. So whether or not you believe in climate change, it is something that we need to address, yeah? So this here is just a timeline of all the activities. Mr. Kumar Singh would have explained some of the different international treaties and so on that would have taken place over time. Some of you who are attending this would know that there has been significant focus since the Brundtland Commission in 1987 that introduced the whole sustainable development concept. So you had all sorts of different iterations of international and regional agreements that would have taken place. But at the same time, one might want to ask ourselves, have we really become more climate resilient? Are we better off in 2023 than we were in 2000? Are we better off in 2023 than we were in 1990? And that's really something that we need to think about, because despite all these activities and all this focus, is Trinidad and Tobago more climate resilient now than we were 30 years ago? And the answer to that may be varied depending on who you ask, but for me, it's certainly no. And when you look at all the iterations of COP and all the international agreements, we have to be careful as a small island developing state, because many of the climate financing options are really loans, and other times they are what we call boomerang funding in terms of European agencies, etc., providing funding for you to do some sort of climate adaptation or mitigation intervention, wherein a significant portion of the resources actually goes back to the donor country, because you get equipment from there, you get expertise from there. I am one who really believes that the Caribbean must take care of itself. We have to ensure that we build our capacity. And yes, we need to participate in all of these events and ensure that we have a voice. But at the same time, we must fight for our independence and ensure that we take care of us. Now, in terms of critical issues, the one thing that we must consider when you talk about climate change, hazards, and disaster is that not all hazards can translate into a disaster. Yeah? A hazard only becomes a disaster when it affects people. And that is a very critical point, because what that means is that there is another element to this whole climate change concern. And if you examine everything that has happened in the past 50 years in Trinidad and Tobago and the Caribbean at large, it is definitely not just the climate that has changed. Other things have changed. Other things have changed that we have contributed to. And many times, persons use this climate change rhetoric as it's unprecedented rainfall. It's the effects of climate change. And quite frankly, we have no as small and developing states, we do not have any significant control over climate change. If we cut our global carbon emissions, our national carbon emissions to zero, the global impact is going to be minimal. So by doing that, it's almost like you're passing on the responsibility and saying it's an act of God, wherein many of our actions are separate and apart from climate change could be what is resulting in us being in the position we are today. So I wanted to highlight that and to highlight that very strongly. Further to that, climate change and human choices, which follows directly from what I'm saying before. Climate change is one factor, what you choose to do in terms of, the type of cars you drive, etc., your carbon footprint. That is something that could contribute to climate change or does contribute to climate change. But our choices, where we build, the manner in which we interact with the environment, the type of development, our developmental ambitions many times could be one of the problems in terms of how we develop and where we develop, affecting or altering the natural ecosystem, leading to some of the problems that we face. And then further to that, I'm not going to speak too much about vulnerability, but because others would have highlighted it, we know that we are vulnerable. We are small and developing states. You have many coastal populations, settlements. You also have persons who are, not financially as gifted in a sense, not having the same financial capacity to recover as others. And it's very concerning because many times a hazard, wherever it occurs, the most vulnerable are those who suffer the most, right? And then in terms of mitigation and adaptation, anytime you hear about climate change, we speak about mitigation, which are really actions that aim to reduce the causes of climate change, whereas adaptation involves modifying our decisions and activities and ways to think to adjust to this changing climate. And we have to really focus on the adaptation end. As I mentioned before, no matter what we do in terms of if we stop having any carbon emissions or any sort of greenhouse gas emission that contributes to climate change, the result on a global level will be limited. So our focus must be on adaptation. We must find ways to survive and to survive in an effective manner, given the consequences of climate change that we are certainly, or we will certainly face. Now, climate risks. What exactly is climate risks? That risk is something that depends on the scale of anthropogenic climate change at the global level. So the point of this slide is to highlight that it is not something that occurs in a silo. What will happen is on a global level, you will have impacts from all the emissions, etc., from all the activities of all the countries that you are then subject to. And if we go back to the SDGs, for instance, which are global indicators or global goals, that is supported by indicators that all countries who have signed on to Agenda 2030 are trying to meet. Is it really fair? These are questions we need to ask. And the reason I'm asking, is it fair, is because many of the developed countries who have gotten to the point where they could say that they are 100% compliant to most of these agreements, they would have never gotten to the point they are now by developing sustainably. So an example could be, are we to tell Guyana not to develop their oil industry because it's something that is going to lead to global warming and climate change, etc.? Should we do that? Is it fair that countries that are different tiers in terms of their developmental status are being held to the same standards? So when we look at climate risks, it is really something many times that at a national level, you do not have much control in terms of the hazard itself. What we have control over is our adaptation and our ability to cope. And that is why I stressed before that we should be focusing on adaptation. Now, climate change and its impacts, I think, again, my colleagues before would have highlighted some of these things. So we are very aware that climate change and the impacts could lead to directly affecting water and sanitation, agriculture, food security, human health, and so on. So we understand that a hazard could have impacts on multiple sectors. So I would not necessarily go in any further on that. In terms of climate change and SIDS specifically, these are important statements. So climate change in the Caribbean is something that is disproportionately affects small and developing states because of our size, our economy, etc. You also have complex social and economic and ecological consequences of recurring hazards. And many times it leaves our countries in a constant state of recovery. Mr. Kumar Singh would have mentioned the Build Back Better principle, which is a component of the Sendai framework. And do we actually build back better? Going back to the example of the Manzilina Road, I did not know that it washed away in the 70s as well, but I did raise this in another forum where it was washed away, I think, in 2017 and again in 2022. And, you know, the idea is that if you keep continuing to do the same thing without any improvements, you will have issues. And granted that it's a road that, you know, has a history of being inundated because of the type of soil, etc., the type of interventions that we do is critical. So anytime you have engineered interventions, that is perhaps one of the preferred ways to deal with these things currently. But it's obviously very expensive, and it always leads to an alteration in the environment. It always shifts the problem to some point. So from, I guess, preliminary assessment, you would see that what they would have done on that road in 2017 to fix it, it was explained to me that the parts that they fixed was not, you know, affected in this second iteration in 2022. And to me, it was obvious that if you fix one point, obviously you're shifting the point to another, you're shifting the problem to another point along the road. So we have to look at these things in a holistic manner and also incorporate nature-based solutions rather than just engineered interventions, right? And I have a statement here, there is a need to consider and plan for consecutive and multiple hazards in the Caribbean, because the eventuality is very, very possible. Again, in terms of sea level rise, I will just summarize this. This is a lot to take in, but we accept that because we are small islands, sea level rise is something that can have significant impacts in terms of reducing the land area. Recently, in a land policy conference, it was highlighted that we don't actually know the shape of Trinidad right now. The last LiDAR imagery of Trinidad was 2014. And because of climate change, etc., it's quite possible the actual shape of Trinidad has changed. And we recognize that global temperature and sea level rise are strongly linked. And a 2 to 2.5 degree increase will continue to accelerate the current state of sea level rise. So it's another thing that we have to consider. And then this could lead to less land, salinization of soils, loss of communities, etc. Now, another thing that we also have to consider is that there is one concern with hydroclimatic disasters on one extreme, which generally focuses on what we have been facing, which is flooding, etc. But the other insidious counterpart, which we call droughts, are also possible. So you had this 2010 drought period where there was significant impacts, and not just in Trinidad, across the region. And as pointed out by one of the previous speakers, all climate projections indicate that the Caribbean is going to get drier. The drier seasons, the intensity, etc., of rainfall in the rainy season will increase, but certainly you expect it to have drier conditions based on the projections. And this slide really just highlights some of the key things that would have happened in the past in terms of grazing land being lost, increases in food prices, and so on and so forth, and access to water, which was also a critical issue. Even in this current dry season, you would have seen WASA would have issued some restrictions and so on. Right, so I highlighted this before, so I will not go into it in any detail, but we recognize with the increased frequency and intensity of storms, you will have effects like landslides, flooding, wind, and so on. And it is something that we see on a yearly basis. And then in terms of compound effects, which is what I was trying to highlight at the start of my presentation, as a result of climate change, it's very possible for consecutive hazards to become more common, which will require more planning and emphasis going forward. The situation of more than one natural hazard affecting islands highlights the vulnerability of the Caribbean. And if we consider a plan for consecutive hazards is very, very critical for the Caribbean. Examples would be the COVID-19, which affected food security in the case of our colleagues in Bahamas, right after they were still recovering from Hurricane Dorian, COVID-19 came and there was issues with human health and access to resources, etc. You could have extreme rainfalls in the midst of everything else that you are dealing with. You could have volcanic eruptions, and all of these things could affect water availability and access. Now, that being said, one of the things that was not really highlighted before is what can we really do about this? What are the solutions? And I have a few that have been highlighted here, which are nature-based solutions, ecosystem-based. Simple things, rainwater harvesting, underground stormwater storage, green roofs, proper regulation in terms of building. We see many times, if you examine the nature of flooding in Trinidad, you will see that we treat symptoms. So for instance, Port of Spain floods, we try to address the problem in Port of Spain, but that's not the problem. The problem is where the water is coming from and the rate at which it's coming to that particular point, which stems from upper watershed issues, where development tends to be unregulated, town and country planning, I guess they are strapped for resources, etc. But we see things that mean even if you're remotely familiar with our regulations, that should not be approved. And it's not just squatters, it's also, the other extreme. So you have also integrated water resources management. I'm happy to say that that policy was passed recently. We had that in a draft format for quite some time, but I think it was finally approved in December 2022. We also need better inter- and intra-agency coordination, and that's at the state level. So all the different ministry arms need to collaborate better. And I mean, this may not be the prime example, but when you look at the roads and then the road is paved and then WASA comes to fix a leak subsequent to that, that is an example of poor inter- and intra-agency coordination. We're also looking at early warning systems, which is where you would be able to provide information to persons who are expected to be affected beforehand so that they can act and put things in place. I mean, I think this is fairly okay now. There are some improvements coming on stream soon through the actions of our host today, the ODPM, and a couple other state agencies. But one of the challenges is that generally the public does not take these warnings seriously. People will still stay in their homes, etc. And that's the challenge going forward, finding a way to maybe do impact-based forecasting so persons will understand what a hazard or what a certain threat is, what it will translate to. It means so much water, it means that your house could be covered, etc. Right? And then we also have climate smart agriculture, which is something we know that our food security is an issue and something that we have to build upon, right? Continuing on what we can do, we have improved technology in terms of our resources, our water resources. Trinidad, I have to say, we always talk about the negatives, but we are one of the only Caribbean countries who has so much wastewater treatment plants. I think up to 30% of our water or wastewater is treated before it re-enters the environment. And there's recently a standard that was developed by TTBS in collaboration with MPU, WASA, and so on, that speaks to the use of treated wastewater for agriculture and landscaping uses. As I mentioned before, we must promote climate-sensitive farming and agriculture. We must have improved land management capability and suitability analysis. The last land management or land capability assessment that was done for Trinidad was in the 1970s. And if you examine that, as well as the land use policy, you would see many of the places that have become very developed were never forecasted or planned to be housing developments. So that's another critical issue. And also we need improved research towards data-driven decision-making so that what we do is informed by science. And of course, explore innovative ideas. Like insect farming, for instance, is a new and novel thing that universities is looking at. And not insect farming for persons to consume insects, but really to use it as a substitute for the protein in animal feed, because we know that this is one of the most expensive components of rearing animals in terms of livestock. So that is being done in collaboration with FAO, and it's something that is supposed to create a whole new sector and improve our food security resilience. Now, these are some recent developments, some of which I mentioned before. The IWRM policy was in 2022. The wastewater reuse standard again was in 2022. The insect farming that I just mentioned. We also had, in terms of agriculture, the GAP policy, which is the Good Agricultural Practices Policy, which is supposed, it's voluntary at this point, but it's meant to push farmers towards doing proper or approved techniques in terms of how they farm so that our products could be exported and so on. And then you have the CARICOM 25 by 2025 initiative, which is something that is really meant to help us reduce our food import bill by 25%. So with all the negative things that are happening, there are positives in the background as well. We also did some work with the FAO on salt-affected soils, which, as I mentioned, I think earlier, that due to sea level rise and climate change and higher temperatures, etc., you expect changes in soils, and salinity will affect fertility, right? So we recognize through this mapping process that there isn't, at this point, any significant amount of salinity or sodicity in Trinidad and Tobago at two levels. We did the soils at 0 to 30 and 30 to 100 centimeters. We also, there's numerous stuff. I mean, we always do assessments of flood risk analysis, communities and so on. And we know the areas that are going to be affected. So our actions now must focus on implementation of interventions. We are past assessments in my mind. It is not like we are clueless about where it is going to flood and where these places are and how many people are going to be affected, etc. We also explore the use of nature-based solutions towards improving slope management. And this is a key sort of way going forward where you utilize certain types of grasses to extract moisture from the soil. And this is just a picture showing a experimental site. And we found things like vetiver grass, for instance, has a very high suction. It removes about 20% more moisture than if it's bare, and maybe about 15% more than if it has, conventional natural vegetation, what we call opportunistic species. So it's also an opportunity for us to, tackle the slope stability problem by simultaneously dealing with the climate change problem by having more vegetation, etc. And obviously, it's much cheaper than if you have engineered interventions. And from a university angle, it would be remiss of me to not mention what we are doing. We have introduced a new major in disaster risk resilience for agriculture and the environment that is expected, well, it will start in September 2022. I will cover much of the things that we are talking about here, both from an environmental perspective and both from an agricultural perspective, as well as looking at things like land management and water resources management and, food security and so on. Now, the key messages, what I would leave you guys with is that, as I said before, we have to focus on adaptation. We must improve efficiency of our interventions. And by that, I mean, we should not just be reactive. Many times our preparations for climate change or any sort of environmental hazard is subsequent to the hazard occurring, and the preparation beforehand is not ready yet. So if the road gets washed away, then we go and try to fix it, rather than understanding that the road will get washed away and we need to fix it beforehand. Then data-driven decision-making. We have to ensure that whatever decisions we make are informed by science, so that there is some evidence to show that what interventions or what you're putting in place is actually, from a scientific perspective, makes sense, rather than it being, social and political, etc. And then you have coordination among state and developmental agencies. I already spoke about that. And then participatory approaches is this top-down sort of, rhetoric that we would have portrayed in the past is not something that is good. We need to have persons who live in communities contribute towards the decisions because they've been living there for some time. They've been interacting with the rivers. They've been interacting with the land. They may understand things in ways that not even the scientists can. They may provide you with information and perhaps suggestions that you may not have even considered. So it's not a top-down approach. It's one where you have maybe a bottoms-up approach where you have the problems being identified by the communities, etc. And then based on those things, you provide solutions to them. and then impact-based forecasting and early warning system. So perspectives to consider going forward as I end. While climate change is an obvious concern, we must be cautious in connecting impacts we are experiencing to a phenomenon on which we have limited influence. And I explained why I said that before. Is climate the only thing that has changed in the past 30 years? What is the role or our role in these outcomes? Are our developmental ambitions and decisions influencing these outcomes? So while I am not disputing climate change is a major concern, I think it is very, very important that we accept as a people and as a country that the outcomes we face today are not solely because of climate change. So with that, I end. Thank you, you all for your attention. And if there are any questions, I'll be more than happy to entertain them. Thank you.
Dr. Rupnarayan, thank you very, very much for your comprehensive presentation and your very helpful visual aids. For one, I certainly appreciated the take you had on the compound effects of climate change. I think it's something that is very under-discussed in terms of the ways we can indirectly but be severely affected in ways that aren't overly apparent when we think about climate change, such as the effects of COVID-19 on food production and so on. So I really appreciate your approach for us this morning. I saw that in the chat, there was a mention made by Mr. Kumar Singh regarding the geomorphology of the Manzanilla sandbank. I just wanted to give Mr. Kumar Singh the opportunity, if he's able, to speak to that for our participants online. Mr. Kumar Singh.
Thank you. No, I know Dr. Rupnarayan drew on the same example that I had mentioned. But the geomorphology of the sandbank itself is one that facilitates movement because it's not bedrock and facilitates the sheet kind of drainage that happens with the river swamp. So what I'm suggesting is that unless the climate risks associated with that geomorphology is taken into account in designing any road, then the same thing will happen again and again. So it's about building back better, building back with climate risk integrated into the engineering designs.
All right. Thank you so much. Ms. Subrat Ali, I see that your hand is raised.
Yes, I just wanted to add that with the currents in that area and the longshore drift, the road will eventually get cut off by the sea. So we also need to consider that as well.
All right, thank you so much, Ms. Subrat Ali. I'm noting not a question, but a comment in our chat pertaining to the benefits of planting the vetiver grass as a material for manufacture, deodorizer for garments and linens. But Belize is actually using vetiver planting for soil protection. So I guess the uses are taking root, as it were.
Yeah, just to add to that, Keller, if I may, I didn't expound too much upon it, but it's something that we're doing here as well. And the idea is that, I don't want people to think vetiver grass is the ultimate solution. And that's why I keep mentioning there is a way to marry both the engineering and the nature-based. Looking at one side alone is not the solution, because obviously you need some engineering intervention as well. But there are persons who would have utilized vetiver grass and it's not working because of the manner in which it's planted, and you will have rills and gullies in between. So you might see it being planted on a slope somewhere and you might say, but this is not really helping because you're still seeing all the gullies in between. And it's because of the way in which it's planted and the sphere of influence of the roots. So it's a sort of a taproot. So when the plant gets older, the sphere of influence in terms of suction or removing moisture goes deeper into the soil. Yeah. And you need to sort of have a companion planting, maybe have the turf grass or something in between to ensure, or maybe staggered planting where you have young and old vetiver grass on the same slope. Because it's not a plant vetiver grass and you will have no more land slippage. I just wanted to make that clear so people understand. And yes, there are additional benefits. They're using it for all sorts of things around the region and globally as well. So thanks.
All right, thanks again, Dr. Rupnarayan. Just one more comment before we go on from our participants this morning, where they say excellent presentations thus far, and they're hoping to see more on how we develop our climate resilience through addressing systems like energy, waste, and water. So it's definitely something that we can seek to arrange in future where we address these things a bit more directly. And with that, I think we'll be moving right along.
Sorry,
So,
Kellen, there's a
yeah.
question directly to me that I feel I should probably respond to
Sure, please
on
do.
the chat. It's from Carol, and she's asking, is insect farming geared for food security of animals, hoping not for people? Well, interestingly, insects are eaten in Asia and Africa normal. It's part and parcel of their culture. We eat wild meat, but somehow, iguana and manikou and these sorts of things. But our concept, our culture does not, sort of lead us towards eating insects. So we understand that. And by improving food security for animals, we're indirectly improving food security for people. So the idea is to first ensure that the insect farming is used to produce larvae, which can be used for protein, for like aquaculture, for poultry, etc., which will reduce our import costs in terms of the amount of animal feed and so on that we require, and it'll be at a cheaper price. And once it proves successful, it's possible that you can have an insect farming sector developing where persons can learn to do this at a community level and start making lives and livelihoods out of it. And it's something that has started in Trinidad. The University of the West Indies and University Field Station will be the hub, but it's also planned to be shared or shelled out in Jamaica, Barbados, and I can't remember the other country offhand right now, but it's something that is a regional effort that we hope to action once we prove that it's safe and it's feasible going forward. So
Thank you very much for that, Dr. Rupnarayan, as well. All right, folks. So we will be moving right along. I'm encouraging persons again to use the question and answer feature. And even if it's after a presentation is already completed, we can always come back to the questions at the end. So please do. And we're going to move right along with that to our very next presentation being done by Ms. Catherine Badlu Durga of the Ministry of Works and Transport. And she has worked for the ministry for the past 18 years in 3 major divisions, 10 years in the construction division, 7 years as chief planning engineer in the highways division. And currently, as we would have mentioned earlier, she's currently the director of drainage. Ms. Badlu Durga would have graduated from the University of the West Indies in St. Augustine with a BSc in civil engineering, and she holds a master's degree in construction engineering and management. She is a registered engineer with the Board of Engineering, as well as a member of the Association of Professional Engineers of Trinidad and Tobago. The director would have served on multiple committees ranging from the disaster prevention and preparedness to structural assessments and retrofitting, as well as the community flood early warning system on behalf of the ministry. Now, the drainage division is the executing agency responsible for the maintenance of major natural watercourses in Trinidad as they mitigate and alleviate flooding and erosion through the execution of construction and desilting projects. The division builds and maintains irrigation systems while ensuring all approvals for land development have satisfied the division's approval process. They also provide advisory services for drainage matters to other government agencies. Good morning again, Ms. Badlu Durga. Happy to have you with us.
Morning, everyone. Happy to be here. So this morning, I would be sharing a little different perspective from the ministry as to show what we have been doing in response to disaster or these disasters happening and our changing environment, right? So permit me to share my screen.
All right.
Now, let me see. Is it visible right now? Just confirm.
Yes, fully visible.
Okay, great. So let's begin. I think Kellen would have taken care of my first slide just to describe what our mission statement is and our mandate. And as he mentioned, it really is to protect people, property, and our environment from flood risks as we apply best practices in using integrated watershed management techniques and promoting sustainability at an affordable cost. So moving on, he would have mentioned also some of our core functions. So I could just skip over this slide. The effects of climate change on our division, especially as one part of the entire Ministry of Works and Transport, I'll just focus on drainage division for now. We have seen damage done to our already aged infrastructure, as many of the presenters would have shown that we have infrastructure failing because of flooding events happening all over the country. So the increased volume of water that we are getting leads to an increased amount of emergency works we have to perform to restore connectivity in a short space of time. And we also see different, like the whole public would have seen culverts collapse, road washed away. Different types of bridges may be affected as well, abutments fail. You name it, it has happened and it is happening. Now we are particularly charged with this I don't know what to say. It's like almost a little tease, as if we have now inherited this infrastructure that is already at the end of its design life. And now we have to now implement new infrastructure that would take into consideration the effects of climate change. So that is why we also have to monitor the type of rainfall. If you would notice, has been mentioned before, the rainfall patterns have drastically changed in this lifetime that I have. I'm sure you too, you would have seen a very, very different type of weather event that we're seeing happening, sorry. And in a short space of time, you would see heavy rainfall coming, a lot of water coming out of nowhere. It's just downpour after downpour. And in some areas, when the soil gets super saturated, there's no more room. The water can't percolate anymore. So where does it go? It has to go somewhere, and it's our job to ensure that it reaches to a watercourse nearby from any development, any roadway, that it reaches safely to a place of discharge. So that's why we see some areas, you would see massive flooding happening. And sometimes no matter what you do, you would see it happen. You can't stop flooding. Let me just say that out front. We can't stop flooding. What we can do right now is mitigate to our best ability. Right now, we have to work together, as mentioned before by my colleague. We have to work together. It's not one agency's problem. It's not one government's problem. It's everybody's problem. You have to be part of the solution as well. So moving on, because I think we are almost out of time in the next half hour, so I'll move a little further. Now, we came up with the strategic drainage plan. I don't know if the public has been hearing this coming time and time again, that the government has a drainage plan and, we're going to execute it and all that. But to just put it simply, what we did is take all the past plans that we had, all the studies that we had, which was regrettably only for half of Trinidad, and we put it together, made a rapid assessment by one of the consultants, and they now formulated this long priority listing that we are pulling from to do projects that are both structural and non-structural in nature, which means that simply some are projects that are ready to go, that we need to do more embankments, more replacement of infrastructure. And then again, we have to continue these studies. These would be considered the non-structural parts of the whole plan, right? So it's also a document that when we do further studies, we can now revisit the document, and that priority listing will change. It's subject to change because every day we see more and more different problems popping up every day. Once you see rainfall, another area happen, another landslip happen, another bridge has washed out. So these projects will be shifting as the time goes, and as further studies come in, it will be applied to the existing SDP or strategic drainage plan. Now, our strategy in the division is really to break it down into about 7 different spots, right? So now we're looking at maintenance, the watercourses and infrastructure, the restoration of and rehabilitation of the embankments under the division's purview. We want to keep this maintained. We also have to maintain the lined watercourses as well. Some of them would be failing. Those that are paved, in some areas, it's simply because people have built so close to the watercourse that there is no embankment. So now they had to concretize some of them in built up areas like Diego Martin, Marval, those areas would have paved watercourses. And over time, the lining becomes eroded, it becomes scoured. So we have to replace it. We have to go back in, we have to do major works. But as you may understand, these works are really limited in time because when rainfall you can't work inside the watercourse. So it's really highly dependent on the dry season. And as you can see, the dry season is shorter and shorter every year. So we are really limited to like 5 months of the year to actually execute these types of work. The second strategy we're looking at is the structural type of work we have to do, which is the upgrade of our pumps and gates, the new infrastructure, and the construction of new embankments in certain areas. Where there are none, we're going to now implement some. The non-structural one, as I mentioned before, would be reviewing of existing studies and also doing new studies in areas that we didn't have information for prior to now. And also be part of the public education and awareness campaigns, mainly to show people how flooding affects them, how they probably lend to the whole flooding problem in the first place, to show people how when they construct, they need to bear in mind there is a reserve, there is a way that you need to construct to preserve your own family, your property, your life. It is important to know how you construct really benefits you, and it also saves you from any flooding events in the future. The legal reform we're looking at is legislation, the legislation process for river reserves and enforcement of the drain and enforcement of our reserve itself, and also to develop a drainage manual. We have to now consider climate change and also innovation in that manual, because previously the existing policies we have don't really take into consideration the effects of climate change, because it's like a historic document that we have inherited over the years. So now we are now reformulating that policy, looking at increasing the type of design criteria that we need consultants and contractors to use when they're doing any type of infrastructure. And also we want to look at institutional strengthening and reform, because within the ministry itself, we have issues with staffing, equipment, vehicles, tools, all these things that a typical government agency need to have these equipment functioning, working, in-house equipment, so that we can respond to different types of emergencies. And I'm not only talking about the drainage division, I'm talking about the ministry as a whole. We have aged infrastructure, we have aged equipment as well. So our ability to respond and also to facilitate people like the DMUs together with the ODPM, when we're called to action, we sometimes don't have enough equipment to go around and have to also just resort to contractors. And, you know, this is costly. So if we have our own equipment to respond, at least, better equipment, newer equipment, we can manage the response a lot quicker. The last two points I wanted to mention is actually safety and the emergency response plan. So I went into the response plan a little too early, but you know what I mean. So the idea is to have equipment and material on standby in case there is let's say, a failed embankment. We have the equipment to carry it there. We have a stockpile. We could just take it in and go and repair the embankment in the shortest period of time, so that people's property is saved, fewer lives are lost. Unfortunately, sometimes it's because when certain people see we doing, I think the whole nation would see right now we're undertaking our desilting program. When the water courses are cleared and the embankments are now clean and laid out, some people unfortunately take that to mean that they can now go plant on the embankment. And now we are faced with a weakened embankment when they just go in and then claim property that is now theirs unfortunately, all these things we have to face on a daily basis, right? And the weakening of the embankment then leads to any type of flooding event. It fails. So then we're left with breaches. And then, first thing they say is that we're not maintaining these things. But unfortunately, it's sometimes the public doing things to themselves. And I'm not saying that we are perfect. We are all trying our best. But sometimes the public needs to be aware that their actions really do, it works against them sometimes. And they need to understand what their impact on the environment is in a simple thing like just going and planting on the embankment. Watering it daily, you would see when we go to check, we'd see little fissures developing, and then you see material loss, and then you see areas that are just cut down, and the embankment is, all these damages in areas that, we have frequent farming and all that. It's detrimental in the long run when a flooding event happens. So I briefly touched on the non-structural measures, but I just wanted to expand a bit because it was mentioned that the flood early warning system and monitoring framework is needed so that when an event is happening or when a potential hazard is noticed, that people are warned in efficient time. We are part of that whole CFU's project, the Community Flood Early Warning System. And that has, I think it was launched in Tobago recently, and we would be launching different gauges in Trinidad later on. Together with the ODPM, that is, we are part of that whole team. The flood reporting system is an internal system that we have within the ministry, apart from local government. We have our own reporting system where, if we get information, we would share it with local government and vice versa. It's a way of being on top of the areas that flood so we can inform the public accordingly so that we don't have people driving through floodwaters. We don't have people attempting to go through the water to go to any particular area because they will be putting themselves at risk. There's also, I mentioned the revision of the strategic drainage plan. And just to mention, the public awareness campaign is something that we want to really embark on so that not just the ministry would be in the forefront, but we were just looking to work together with the different agencies, the NGOs, everyone who would be part of this public awareness campaign, Ministry of Education, perhaps, because it starts from when you go to school, the children learn, and what they learn in school, they take home to them, their parents, their family, their friends, and that's where we want to start. We want to foster this whole new campaign, a whole new outlook on how we treat with this type of disaster management. Legal reform really and truly is one of the biggest problems we have currently. We have a lot of people encroaching on areas that we know are reserved for the watercourse. And it needs to have, the water needs to have place to move. When you're on a riverbank and you have a flood event, the water comes up and it spreads. And if you are on the riverbank, for instance, we have a lot of squatters that occupy the entire riverbank. And then when an event happens and they are affected, they claim for damages. And really and truly, we don't have any enforcement in place. And I'm not talking about the ministry, I'm talking about Trinidad as a whole. We really don't enforce the type of legal reform we need. We need legislation that will help protect the embankments, our reserve, to make sure that people are not going to lose their lives just because they need a place to plant or they need a place to live. I understand living is, everyone needs a place to live. But when you put yourself at risk, it really, 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 it just makes us go backwards. And we need the cooperation of Town and Country. We need the cooperation of the regional corporations. We really do need the enforcement implemented, because without that, this is going to happen every year. We're going to have uncontrolled developments happening all over, and people are building more and more up on the hillsides. We're seeing hillside development as a new risk. I mean, it's people building not realizing what is happening when you take away the green space that is supposed to be there for water percolating into the soil. It's now replaced with asphalt or concrete, nowhere for the water to percolate. And then we have runoff. And then that's why you're seeing more and more areas flooding and people saying, here never used to flood before. And then when you notice, you take a macro view, you look all around, and then you see 8 or 9 developments have gone up in the last 2 years or 3 years. And it now eliminates that area that the water used to settle and be absorbed, percolated before. It's just runoff. So now a lot more people are affected. And then when people are building in flood-prone areas, I agree, they have to learn to adapt. If that is where you have to build, well, then you need to build to consider the water that you're going to be facing in a rainfall event. In heavy rainfall, you know it's going to water floods traditionally, then we have to adapt and build. I'm not encouraging building in a flood-prone area, but we know it happens. So it's just a way of protecting life and property that we build and adapt in a way that would be saving your life, basically. So that's just an overview of everything we're looking for. So it's not just going and desilting every year, but also updating the drainage guidelines that we have, developing the flood reporting system, just to say the non-structural measures that we are doing, and the undertaking of the studies in the critical areas that I mentioned before that we don't have existing information for. I did mention the desilting projects, but I mean, that's what we are doing right now, that because we have to keep the capacity of these watercourses as much as we can. And we do this by removing the excess siltation and also reestablishing the riverbanks and embankments all over Trinidad. This has to be done as a maintenance program so that water, when rain falls, there is somewhere for it to go. We ensure that this water goes into a watercourse and not remains on your roadways, in your property, in your homes. That's why these projects are so critical to do every year. And we are challenged to do these in the dry season. But as we see, sometimes the dry season is taken from us very, very early. So we have to act as quickly as we can. This year, we're targeting over 500 projects across Trinidad and Tobago. We are clearing blockages when necessary. We are ensuring that channels perform adequately to make sure that they keep their capacity and they're not restricted in any way. And we reinstate embankments and side slopes as needed. So that brings me to the end of my presentation. If you have any questions, you can ask now. This is our contact information at head office, just letting you know. And that's it. Thank you so much for the opportunity, Kellon, and the ODPM team for having me today.
Always happy to have you on. And I noted a few questions coming in as you spoke. I think you might have touched on addressing them during your presentation because they came in while you were speaking. Mm-hmm. But if there's any more information you could provide, that would be great, or a simple, recap for the audience here. The first one touches on the citizens in Fishing Pond Village who would have dug a trench to allow water to escape to the sea last week. And the audience member is asking is this advisable, considering the immediate relief as opposed to the subsequent effects that could be caused? And if so, should we consider safe solutions to prevent debris from entering the ocean as well?
That's a mouthful. So, yeah. So I believe we discourage the public from doing that, their own interventions when it comes to the watercourses, right? I think I know what they're referring to. It was the mouth of the Oropouche River that the villagers in Fishing Pond did. It's not advisable that they do it on their own because really and truly, it is very dangerous if you're going to open a river mouth. It can start at 2 feet and then the water rushes out so quickly that it will take you with it. So unless you have the training, and these guys did have the training, and let me give them props. They had the training and they were experienced in it, and they saw a need to do it and they went ahead and do it. But I'm not encouraging the general public to do it. It's very, very dangerous. It's a safety hazard. It's a risk, but also we are developing some monitoring devices. I think it's like gauges we want to put in, especially at that mouth at the Oropouche. It really is a tricky area because of the tidal action there. It will, in the dry season, block the watercourse. The river mouth will be blocked. It has a lot of siltation at that point. And what they did is, because there was so much rain in that small place, I think it was 2 weeks ago, they saw the need to go in and clear the water, the mouth of the Oropouche. It helped. It is what we're supposed to do. And they went ahead and did it without consulting anyone. But I mean, these guys are experienced. They had a particular interest, because it's in the land. I mean, I'm not gonna lie, they are people from the area and they're concerned. And if they didn't do that, the water would not have flowed out as quickly as it did. So we do appreciate the help. However, it's very dangerous to do that. So people, if you do not have the experience, please do not attempt to do this. Any watercourse cleaning or anything like that, leave it to the ministry, leave it to people who can do it, with proper equipment. But unfortunately, that area there is also protected. So you cannot enter at the mouth of the Oropouche with equipment to do that cleaning. So it has to be done by hand. And the gauges we want to look to put in there will monitor it so that we know when to go in. And it only needs to be cleaned like once a year in the dry season. And after the first rain, the mouth opens up, and then we have consistent flow after that.
All right, thanks very much. I see a raised hand from Dr. Ronald Rupnarai.
Yeah, thanks. I just wanted to, I think what Catherine would have shared is very, very important, noting the dangers, etc. But I wanted to highlight from a public perspective. You contact the Ministry of Works, you indicate what is happening. Are we supposed to sit and wait until they get there? Or is there a formal process? What is I assume that these persons would have initiated their own actions because there was some, no response, or there was perhaps some delayed response. So while we could wait and follow the regulations, etc., are we expecting persons to do that and face the consequences of whatever hazard, in this case, potential flooding?
Well, to respond to that question is that those particular persons had crops in the area, so they were there. They did not consult to ask permission to go, because it's something that they may do if they see the need. So if they do come to us, we have districts that respond immediately. However, if there is a dangerous situation, you cannot put anybody at risk to go in a flooded area. You have to wait to see how best to address the situation. Now, these particular villagers had boats to go out because that's their property. They have planted, I wouldn't say their property, let me take that back. I don't know if it's their property, but they have vested interest in the land right around there. They have crops, they had crops. They responded because they saw the immediate need to protect their crops. They went out. They didn't ask for permission. They didn't contact us to say, hey, we're going out. They went out, and they accustomed doing that sometimes because, I mean, it's their property. It's their area that I said it again, it's not their property. I do not know if that's their property. I didn't follow through. But my point is, when you respond, when you ask the ministry for assistance, the ministry would respond very carefully. We wouldn't take our time to respond. We will respond when it's safe to do so. You can't just go through floodwaters with people. Everybody's lives are at stake. And the ministry isn't the first responder. Let me make that clear. The first responders are police and fire. And then we have the local DMUs under the Ministry of Local Government, Rural Development, that has they are the ones that respond locally for localized events. But we do support them when they ask for assistance. We respond through the ODPM. We are contacted. If we weren't contacted before, the DMU contacts us directly. The ODPM contacts us directly as needed. So it's not that people are waiting for us to respond. Sometimes there isn't a response to do. In a flooding event, you cannot just enter. Everyone needs to wait till the water goes down to do something. But let me add, once we have a flooded an event that is triggered, we do have our pumps fueled and are pumping. So we also have people on standby 24 hours. They are in the pump houses ready to respond. So they would put the pumps on in certain areas that we have pumps that are moving the water. But to respond to a house that is flooded, for instance, that wouldn't be directly under the ministry, but we will provide the assistance needed. Like trucks, if they need trucks to go into certain areas to assist the DMUs with sharing out food, water, bedding, anything like that, they do respond. We do respond through the ODPM to the DMUs. So in this particular case, again, let me stress, the villagers did not ask permission. They went out because they are accustomed doing so. And our workers together with them usually go out because they have boats. But you see, over the years, certain people develop certain cultures. And if they see something is happening in their land or in their property where they have a vested interest, they will act. It's only human nature to protect what you have. So it wasn't a case that they, contacted us. We said, no, we're not going. And they went. They never did.
Thanks for the clarification. And I think that's important. But based on what you said, it's clear that it's an ongoing problem. So perhaps it should not be to the point where it gets where they have to contact anybody prior to a flood.
That's why we have noted it, and that's why it's on our part. That's actually one of the projects under the strategic drainage plan to come up with a solution to monitor that particular mouth because of where it is. It's protected, and you cannot just enter with equipment. You need to go in by hand, which is also very, very difficult because you could imagine, fellas, they did it. But we have to obey EMA as well. You can't just track in there with an excavator to do anything in protected lands. So yes, that's it. Any other questions?
Thanks very much. Oh, and just I think about two more, if that's okay with you, Ms. Badlu Durga. I see a raised hand from Mr. Jerry David. Mr. David, you should be able to speak directly to Ms. Badlu Durga.
I'm unmuted now. Thank you very much. Are you hearing me now?
Yes, Mr. David.
Now, community emergency response teams is what I do. That's what the ministry does. And that particular situation that is being highlighted there, I pay all kudos to those people who are protecting Lamont Village up in that Fanny Gandhi area there. And had they not done this, somebody would have gone and would argue and say that and the whole area get flooded out. And you blame the Ministry of Foods. Sometimes you have to look at the issue what these people are there, they have known their village for years. It's their village, not the government village. It is their village. And sometimes we have to make sure that when people want to protect their villages, and they know they have indigenous knowledge of the area, sometimes we intellectualize things so much that we forget is ordinary people who have their lives that they live. And I was happy that I sent all the pics to Ms. Durga because I was getting it live what was happening. From the planning phase to moving to the other phase. When they asked me earlier on, I wasn't bothered. I said, this is what they're accustomed doing. They said, yes, we're accustomed doing this all the time for years. Let the people protect their communities. And I'm all for that. I'm all for community power, community emergency response teams, community emergency response teams, all who sit in the ivory towers and pontificate on all of this. Unless we go into the communities and build it out, village by village, street by street, we don't have enough equipment, we don't have enough first responders, we don't have enough anything in a major crisis, because your homes, my homes, may be underwater. The rubble may be on top of my house and your house. So let's encourage communities to do exactly what they did. Because no Ministry of Works would have gotten there in time to deal with that. And Ms. Durga was totally correct. She knows the situation well. You can't tell Lamont Village, don't go and do that. They're taking you on. They're doing that for 20 years. Understand what I'm saying? So let's encourage and build community emergency response teams. People have to learn to defend themselves. We talk about adaptation, but we talk about it in an intellectual way, in this way that you can write it in a dissertation. Adaptation will be practical stuff, practical. And until we get to that point, we'll be all theorizing. And I'm the one on the ground end. Let me tell you why. I have to face all of this. My people have to face all of it first. Okay? Excuse my passion. I can't help it.
No, thank you very, very much for that impassioned advocacy for community resilience. Thank you very much, Mr. David.
Don't get me wrong, I'm all for community resilience. I'm just saying, in like a normal situation, I'm not talking about that particular situation. In a normal situation, we would not have villagers just going in and doing any work in any water course. That's what I'm trying to promote, because then we'll have people diverting water courses as they see fit, which is happening as well. So along those lines is where I was coming from, Mr. David. It's not the response of communities in particular. It's just like, you know, I'm just asking for them not to go in particular water courses to do work, but it is a risk they're taking as well. But as you mentioned, we do know the situation. We know that they are particularly aware of what they are doing. And that's what I'm saying. If people don't know what they're doing, it's very, very dangerous to put themselves in that situation. Just to clarify.
Thank you very much. Thank you so much. I think we'll take one more question before we move along to our last presentation of the morning, and it pertains to the water courses. Could you indicate how many water courses would have been cleaned or maintained for this year thus far in preparation for the rainy season?
So far, well, we started this particular year as in the fiscal year started in October, right? Works would have begun in January 2023, because for this particular program, we need to have financial releases before we can start the program. So the program began in January, on January 3rd, I believe. And to date, 274 projects have been completed. And we are starting phase 2, where the balance of projects are going to be done to come up to about 500, 506. We're aiming for 506. So that is our complete aim. And as usual, we are targeting all over Trinidad. It's not for one area, it's everywhere. So we have to make sure we address those. It's not before, you will see us working during the rainy season too, because it is a maintenance program. We don't stop when the rain starts. We continue. Once it's safe, we continue. So yeah, we have over 200 projects finished.
Thank you so much. All right, Ms. Badu Durga, a great presentation, and thank you for facilitating these questions. We will come back with some unanswered questions when we wrap up, but for now, we're going to move right along to our last presentation of the morning. And that is being done by Ms. Kumira Gulston, the Hazard Mitigation Specialist at the Office of Disaster Preparedness and Management. Mrs. Gulston's work focuses on providing technical guidance to the development and/or reviewing disaster risk reduction policies, plans, projects, and other regulatory documents, as well as conducting vulnerability, exposure, and risk assessments. Mrs. Gulston has completed her MSc in Integrated Coastal and Ocean Management and has a BSc in Marine Biology and Conservation Biology. Her academic and career interests are multidisciplinary. However, she has a strong passion for project management, environmental management, sustainable development, disaster risk reduction and management, climate change mitigation and adaptation, along with special needs education. Good morning again, Ms. Kumira Gulston.
Good morning. Thank you, Kellen, for having me. Just give me a minute. Can you unshare so I could get access, please?
Sure.
Yeah.
You can go right ahead.
Thank you. Okay, so thank you, fellow panelists, for your insight. And thank you, everyone, for joining us and staying with us. Today, I have the responsibility of bringing it all together. As mentioned, my name is Camille Goldstone, and I am the Hazard Mitigation Specialist at the ODPM. And the ODPM is the National Coordinating Agency for Comprehensive Disaster Management in Trinidad and Tobago. So Trinidad and Tobago's hazard landscape is diverse. We're exposed to hydrometeorological, as mentioned by the first presenter, geological, chemical, environmental, technological, extraterrestrial, societal, and biological hazards. Using the United Nations Hazard Definition and Classification Review Technical Report, which was published in 2021 as a benchmark, Trinidad and Tobago is exposed to approximately 253 hazards. However, the climate-exacerbated hazards such as flooding, storm surge, and tropical cyclones are of particular concern because of their impacts. As mentioned by the first presenter in October 2018, approximately 80% of the country was affected by floods, either directly or indirectly. And there were damages, losses, disruptions to livelihoods. Many sought shelter and required evacuation. And this was subsequent to a moderate rainfall event over several days. And when we include climate change in the mix, we expect further rainfall variability and increased likelihood of weather extremes, primarily, but then we also feel the impacts of secondary hazards, such as invasive species, pests and diseases, soil degradation, salinization, biodiversity loss, and ecosystem loss. And these cascading impacts ultimately disrupt the development progress. So what is being done to address this? We heard some examples from Dr. Rupnarayan and Catherine, but from the perspective of the Office of Disaster Preparedness and Management, we have started revising the governance framework for Trinidad and Tobago. And this would include the National Disaster Risk Reduction and Management legislation and policy, and its accompanying country work program. And also we have established the National Disaster Prevention and Preparedness Multi-Sectoral Committee. ODPM sits as the chair with a multi-sectoral approach. And this webinar is part of our month's activities in terms of trying to prepare the public for the wet and hurricane season and ensuring that we have the mechanisms to do so. So based on other interventions by the ODPM, we have started strengthening our national multi-hazard early warning systems. Other presenters would have mentioned the Community Flood Early Warning Systems project. It was launched in Tobago, and look out for the launch in Trinidad in the upcoming weeks. In terms of the public alert notification system, this was also launched last week, Friday. Please stay tuned to our website to learn more details about it. And also feel free to encourage your peers, family members to register so you are able to have real-time alerts when impending disasters happen. In terms of our education awareness programs, this is where we take a deep dive at the community level, support the efforts by the Ministry of Rural Development and local government to ensure that persons are aware of what hazards they are exposed to and ways to mitigate some of these hazards or prevent some of these hazards, and also how to respond. How do you build your emergency kits? How do you formulate your emergency plans? So this is what we try to promote, especially via our social media pages. And also, as mentioned, the strengthening of community early warning systems. And we also recently developed a resilient action plan for Tobago. And all these interventions fall under the umbrella of climate change adaptation. So just as an example, we define mitigation differently. Climate change mitigation is the reduction in greenhouse gas emissions, while disaster mitigation involves any effort to reduce the adverse hazard impact. So we see where the different mechanisms come in play. In terms of climate change, we have the climate change policy led by the Ministry of Planning and Development. under the Paris Agreement. And in terms of its operational coherence, it targets the health, agriculture, water, tourism, transport, and energy sectors. On the other hand, we have within the disaster management realm, we are adhering to the Comprehensive Disaster Management Policy Framework, spearheaded by the Office of Disaster Preparedness and Management, the ODPM, and also along with all the different stakeholders that comprise of the same committee that I would have mentioned, the National Disaster Prevention and Preparedness Committee, on all first responders. And this, the governance framework at the international level is the Sendai framework for disaster risk reduction. We have sectoral integration. However, there is no, at this point in time, there is no sector-specific targeting. In terms of financial coherence, there's no mechanism for mobilization of funds across the two agendas, nor is there any instrument that promotes or proposes joint framework. So we all put this together to say that policy coherence is important. It's an area that we need strengthening in. And while resilience is a recurring theme underpinning both policies, the relationship between climate change adaptation and disaster risk reduction is not well established. However, we have opportunities. We have opportunities for institutional strengthening and to be able to translate some of the opportunities into operational, financial, monitoring, and evaluation reporting coherence. But why is this important? Like many small island developing states, Trinidad and Tobago is especially vulnerable to the effects of climate change. While disasters disrupt societies and economies, we require integrated solutions, understanding disaster risk, and the use of climate information to determine current and future risks. This integrated approach brings together climate change and disaster risk management to leverage approaches and enable integrated and effective management. So just to reiterate some of the points, climate change and disasters expose and increase inequalities. Disaster risk reduction cannot occur without the use of long-term climate projections, as Mr. Kumarsingh would have mentioned, and short-term forecast information, especially that presented by the TTMS. And it takes into consideration a full spectrum of hazards. So all the different cascading effects we see already hazards are integrated into a comprehensive manner. It brings together disaster risk reduction and climate change scientists, policymakers, practitioners, first responders, and so many others, especially persons on the ground, persons within the communities. It leverages the different and complementary approaches to enable a comprehensive understanding of risk and builds resilience. It allows an integrated approach and maximizes the use of limited resources. So while we're on the topic of resources, we see where some challenges arise. Limited financial and technological resources is one of the major challenges that we face. Data availability is another challenge. The unavailability of a strong legislative framework for climate change adaptation and disaster risk reduction, as mentioned. However, despite the challenges, there are also opportunities. So climate change is a recognized priority in the National Development Strategy. In terms of at the national level, we have the support at the national level, especially through the NDPPMC, the National Disaster Prevention and Preparedness Multi-Sectoral Committee. And also we have established partnerships and have achieved technical support from regional and international partners. How are we moving forward? The 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development, the Paris Agreement, and the Sendai Framework for Disaster Reduction calls for coherence. And as a signatory to all these global agendas, Trinidad and Tobago is committed to enhancing coherence in support of the development objectives and moves towards the goal of resilience, establishing a whole system dialogue aimed at better institutional coordination and synergies between different major national plans is important to make sure that this is achieved. So this platform is one of the mechanisms that we are encouraging holistic dialogue. The ODPM has a three-tiered approach in terms of at the strategic level, the operational level, and through community interventions. Some of these were mentioned before, but just to reiterate, promoting awareness and educational campaigns and mainstreaming disaster risk reduction and climate change adaptation into sectoral plans, policies, and programs through the NDPPMC is our top priority. Continuing discussions and collaborating with the Ministry of Planning and Development as the climate change lead. And also mainstreaming disaster risk reduction and climate change adaptation into our different governance frameworks. And another strategy that we employ is to advocate with some of our sector leads. So on the Ministry of Social Development and Family Services, one of them, to make sure that we mainstream climate change adaptation and disaster risk reduction into a proposed shock responsive social protection strategy. In conclusion, through joint risk analysis, joint planning, and coordinated implementation and monitoring, we are able to strengthen synergies between disaster risk reduction and climate change adaptation actors, identifying mutually beneficial opportunities across programs and policies, and covering a full spectrum of climate-related hazards, both extreme events, slow onset processes as well, and ensuring that there is a commonality in terms of understanding how these different hazards interact with each other and have impacts on the people, and making sure that we enhance the capacity of the government to ensure that we have cross-sectional planning while ensuring vertical alignment and leaving no one behind. This is an imperative process of the advocacy, multi-sectoral engagement and capacity development that we underscore. And this is how one of the mechanisms that we employ in terms of ensuring that we have an integrated process. Thank you for your attention. I pass over to the chair for any questions or comments.
Ms. Gulston, thank you very much for your presentation this morning. And yes, of course, we definitely have some questions coming in. Now, these questions are really what we'll use to close our session today. So they're open to all of our presenters this morning who are still with us. Our first question is really just asking if the webinar will be available on YouTube afterwards, and the answer is yes, the webinar will be available on YouTube afterwards for members of the public to view at your convenience. That's one of the things we have opened up as well. So if persons came in late, you can always pull back that YouTube recording to see what you would have missed. And of course, if persons had to leave in between, because we know it's a bit of a long session, you can always catch up on what would have taken place. Now, some of the questions that we have were from earlier this morning. And of course, if it is that they apply to more than one person, everyone is free to jump in to give their intervention. And the first one has to do with regard to erosion. Do we have any historical data on the rate of erosion for the east and south coast that is available to the public?
Perhaps I could share my thoughts here.
Sure, Dr. Rupnarain.
Yeah, there should be some information from IMA that would have done, I am assuming they're referring to coastal erosion, right? Because
Yes.
of the topic at hand. So yes, IMA would have had some studies done over the course of time. But as I mentioned when I was speaking, there is a need to do a comprehensive analysis because the coastline of Trinidad has changed. And as I said, we're not even sure if Trinidad is still shaped the way that we have represented. Yeah. So there is some need to work on that. In terms of land management internally, there is a new project under the UNCCD currently under the remit of the EMA that is going to look at land degradation across the island. It was done previously, I think, in 2017, looking at land degradation neutrality. And now we are going to try to do it again to understand the change between then and now. So I hope that provides some insight based on the questions asked.
Thanks very much, Dr. Rupnarain. I don't know if any of the other presenters wanted to give any input in that regard.
Hi, also, just to add to what Dr. Rupnarayan is saying, I think right now Lands and Surveys is engaged in doing a new LiDAR study. As you mentioned, the last LiDAR data was done in 2014. They are currently doing one. It may take a few months to complete, as you may know. So they would be, I think that information would be available probably later this year into early next year. But a current study is being done through Lands and Surveys. They have started with the Manzan area and they would continue. And I believe Coastal Management, the Coastal Management Unit of the Ministry of Works and Transport also is doing coastal management where they are studying the erosion, the rapid rate of erosion throughout Trinidad, on the coast of Trinidad and Tobago. So they have now started their own compilation of data so that they can map what has happened from 2014 thereabouts to present. So yes, there is data right now.
All right, thank you very, very much. On another note of questions that we would have been asked, given that Trinidad is noted to be flood prone, is there data that shows what changes in the severity of the flooding would have been taking place over time, perhaps over decades, to show, well, if there's any gradual increase or increases in severity?
I don't like being the first one to have to respond all the time, but it's something I deal with as well. So one of the challenges, as our colleagues at the ministry and ODPM would tell us, is when you're modeling flood and flood-prone areas and risks, you need quantitative data, meaning that you want to understand the extent in terms of how far it would have spread across whatever region and also depth. So all our data collection previously has always been point source data, meaning that if there's a flood in Manzanilla, we just have some point, we don't really totally understand the extent and that sort of thing. And it's primarily because resources are limited in agencies. Now with the advent of drone technology and this sort of remote sensing that almost every agency, I know for sure WRA has procured a drone because they came to us to assist with some training, etc. The idea is to now collect that type of data, which will help us to understand the spatial coverage and perhaps even the depth to some extent due to the CFUSE project as well, which will allow us to model it better. Now, as I mentioned when I was speaking, these things are not affected primarily just by climate or rainfall. So while you're doing that on one side, you also have to consider that there are changes in the land use. We had the 2014 LiDAR data, but our land cover in terms of assessment, I think was 2 years before that. For some reason, we did not develop land cover data out of the LiDAR imagery in 2014. So the landscape of the country has changed. And that is something that is very, very important because my Met Office colleagues can probably chime in as well. Because if you look at the amount of rainfall that Trinidad would have received in the last couple of years, and then you go back to the 80s and 70s, in terms of totals, there isn't much like, they tout this unprecedented rainfall and climate change. These types of events have happened before. The intensity would have changed, I agree, but the total amounts, statistically, it is not something that shows any significant change in that regard, apart from the intensity side. So we must ensure that we understand our role. That is very, very important. The hillside developments that Catherine would have spoken about. And it is very, very important to understand that this is not just squatter settlements. This includes state agencies. It includes affluent persons in society who have been given, I guess, the go-ahead to build in these places. Whether they have CECs and they conform to it is another question. But these are some of the issues that could, or most likely, is leading to the outcomes that we are facing here today. And we have multiple flood risk assessments for Trinidad, some of which was done by UEA, including work done by myself from 2012 all the way to as recent as 2022. So we know the areas that are expected to flood. Yeah, thanks.
Thanks again, Dr. Rupnarayan. This might be a question perhaps to Ms. Badlu Durga. With what is taking place where we have persons that build or develop in areas where water settles or is known to traverse. What are the alternatives for those persons who perhaps already own that land? How might they best develop the land, or should they develop on that land at all, whether it's building structures or farming and so on?
Well, remember, land would be zoned for certain purposes, right? So then you would have residential development, or it's strictly for agricultural use. Now, we don't really advise on the purpose of the land. That has to be done by Town and Country and their zoning.
Understood.
Right? So, but my advice would be, if it is for agricultural use, then you have to stick to the agricultural use. If it's your land, you would have inherited through family. If you need to construct, I don't know, you see, there are certain rules for different types of zoning, right? So for agricultural use, you're not allowed to put up more than one structure, temporary structure. You're not supposed to put up a house for that reason. So it's a tough situation, it's a tough answer, but sometimes it's just the way it is. I can't say, because I myself don't own land. I'm gonna be very frank. I am renting. So it's like, that is my personal business, but that's my personal choice. A lot of people have been building in their own property. Yes, they own the property, yes, but for what use? You know, so you have to stick to what Town and Country zone that area for. It's for your best interest. It really isn't advised, if it's for agricultural use, to go putting up a development or, you know, a few homes in that area. If you do, you know, there are some consequences as well. I see Mr. David had his hand up.
Yes, Mr. David, and afterwards we'll move on to Ms. Subrat Ali.
Okay. We have built human settlements in floodplains. That's what we have done. And not only individuals have done it, the state has done it. So what do? All over the world, people learn to adapt because of where they live. I understand Venice is a city that was built over water. I understand that in Bangladesh, people know that the monsoon rains are coming, but they live on the rivers. So until we can get our people to understand that, let me give you an example. We cannot get people to come out of woodland to put them to go to shelters. Impossible. They just wouldn't leave. And if you know woodland is an area that floods perennially and serious flooding. So that if the rains fall the very same way they fell last year, in the very same place, in the very same intensity, the same thing will happen again. Plan for it. So that, and we plan for it at the DMU, in that we will tell people, come and get sandbags. Sandbags are not the panacea. It may help if you're looking to divert, like, how much? A foot and a half, 2 feet of water from your homes. But then when that water is diverted, it doesn't go nowhere. It's going from your place into somebody else's place. Know that. And then and how people have built, so that you find them sounding like if nothing can be done. I've looked at this for over 30 years. And Dr. Ryan will tell you this also. You look at it for 30 years, and the water has been traversing the very same paths for all these years. We have not paid homage to the water itself and respected the water. We said, okay, we're going to build the homes right where the water is supposed to spread out before it gets to the sea. We said, that's what we're not concerned. And then we complain that the water is flooding their homes. And there's a reward for it, you know. The reward for that water flooding your homes is that you can go to the Ministry of Social Development and Family Services and you can get a grant and to buy back some of the furniture you have in your house. That is that's what the state has done. So what we do at local government, we expect flooding, we plan for it, we increase our capacity to respond. We have built capacity quite a bit for high winds, for flooding. We have the, I saw the ODPM got some little thingies. Not the best, but we say thank you anyhow. You say thanks because you had none before. Understand? But we need a different type of vote, but we're working on that also to move more people. If they would come in the votes. Okay, so be prepared for what happened last year and worse, because the buildings didn't move. The drains that Ms. Durga and her ministry cleaned, and they do it all the time. I don't know why people complain about the Ministry of Works. They do it every single year. They clean as much as they could. But who tell you water is not going to inundate all those rivers? Because more development keeps going up all around. You know? The river we spoke about in Lamont that goes into Lamont village, that the villagers want to clean themselves. You know how much quarrying goes on in that area there? Illegal quarry. And up to your waist is soft mud there because of illegal quarrying and all the water washing into that channel. So, as I said, I have to speak from the Ministry of Rural Development and Local Government and be prepared to respond and help people and train people to help themselves. There are other people tasked to do other things. And I hope that they will do their thing because we are quite adequate and prepared to do our thing, our mandate, execute our mandate. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. David, for your recommendations and your words of caution. Ms. Subrat Ali, I noted your hand would have been raised.
Yes, please. So we know what the problems are, and it seems as though there's no very quick fix to it. So in the absence of the hardcore measure of moving people, there is perhaps a partial quick fix or solution in saving lives, and that is wrapped into the community-based flood management system, which is actually a part of the climate risk and early warning systems initiative. And one of the things that will be happening on the weekend of the 19th and 20th is that the cruise team will be in Trinidad, and we will be installing flood markers. I thought this was particularly helpful because if there are flood markers across our country, for example, if there's a particular marker maybe on an electricity pole and there's water crossing the road and it's at a certain level, you know, definitely do not even attempt to go through that. People can know to mobilize their belongings and their families and to get out when water reaches a particular level. So it's not a be-all end-all to the problem, but it is a bit of a partial solution that I think can be a very practical first step towards saving lives and property from flooding.
Thank you so much, Ms. Subrat Ali. Now, with that, I'm going to take this last question from our audience before we depart today. I know that we've long exceeded our time for today, so I appreciate the information that we could have exchanged here this morning. Now, this last question is open to anyone, and that would be in terms of our current design standards for building, right? How can we better our design standards, and what might be done or what could be done to enforce up-to-date design standards for building, whether it be the construction of roads, the construction of drains, or the construction of buildings? How can we better enforce up-to-date design standards? I know it might seem more in the realm of the Bureau of Standards, but for those present here, can anyone offer an intervention for this question?
So most of the approvals would start from the local government side, and then for certain buildings over a certain height, they would be passed on to the ministry's designs branch for approval, right? And we could only approve, when I say we, I mean the Ministry of Works, could approve what is coming for approval, right? Not all people who are doing construction apply for approval, as noted before, right? And what we are saying is that we know if jobs are being done through the ministry or through local government, I believe we have standards to follow. We must follow standards when we are doing public work. There are strict codes we have to work with, AASHTO, for instance, for the roadworks. And then we have the international codes, the IBC, that we follow for building works as well. So we do follow standards and we do follow codes when we are executing projects on behalf of the government. However, the public I think we are also recommending that they do the same. There's the small building code that is recently developed through the TTBS as well, right? And they encourage people to use it to do their construction so that they can mitigate against hurricanes, earthquakes. It shows them basic things they need to do when they're doing home construction. So it is starting. We are trying to push for people to be using codes to do their development and not just hire anybody, any contractor who wants to do work. So it's a culture change. We need to bring that out to the public, so to make sure they encourage their people who are designing homes or businesses to make sure that they use these codes. And once they get approvals, we encourage them to also get approval from Town and Country, the relevant state agencies that need to give these approvals. Yeah, that is basically it in a nutshell.
Thank you very much, Ms. Badudurga. Dr. Rupnarayan, I noted your hand is raised.
Thanks, Kellon. Just to add to that, and I think that's very useful information as well, because previous to these small building codes, we just had engineered or these taller buildings over a certain height having codes in Trinidad. But the small building codes as it stands is voluntary a lot. So persons do not necessarily have to conform. So I want to agree 100% with Catherine that there needs to be a culture change so persons understand the benefits of doing so. And, the solution is really something where it has to be an integrated thing that involves everyone. So for instance, we understand flooding is a problem. The villages or the communities are already established. Why not look at, underground stormwater storage, green roofs, rainwater harvesting to take some of that water out of the system prior to allowing it to get into our drainage ways, etc. And it's not that complicated. Perhaps you could just have incentives for persons who install certain things and tax breaks and that sort of thing. So you're not doing it as the government, but you're encouraging the citizenry to participate in these types of activities that will ultimately lead to their benefits in the long run. And I think that is the approach that we have to push going forward. At the same time, you can't tell somebody, don't do this on your land in a specific way if they conform to all the rules and regulations. And further to that, despite having town and country planning, building codes, all these things that are in existence, a key part that must be mentioned is enforcement of these rules. You will see buildings around our entire country that, as mentioned before, that you clearly is in breach of our protocols. But what has been done? There's nothing that is being done about it. And I don't want this to be skewed towards just squatters, because as I mentioned before, apart from the state, there are many large, affluent segments of society that also participate in these sorts of activities. And we really need to have this addressed. So with that, I would end my response. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Rupnarayan. Now with that, I think we'll take a close to our questions for this morning, but I'm just reminding persons that we have a number of sessions coming up online and in person. So of course, many avenues for the public to interact with us. Before I offer our final remarks for today, I just want to open the floor to our panelists who may have wanted to give one last contribution before we close. I do want to invite now Mr. Lovell from the Trinidad and Tobago Meteorological Service. Mr. Lovell.
Yes, thank you, Kellon. Thanks, and wonderful event. So I just wanted to take the opportunity at this time to invite all our participants to the National Climate Outlook Forum, which the TTMS will be hosting. I think the date is next Friday. I think it's the 12th. And so we're inviting persons, all those who are present this evening, to join us. I think they will maybe get the invitation via the same forums that they would have gotten for this one. And that National Oil Code Forum will answer some of the questions that would have been asked earlier on in terms of the outlook for the upcoming rainy season and hurricane season as well. So persons can get a sense of what the TTMS is projecting in terms of rainfall, the chances of us being affected by tropical cyclones, etc. So I just wanted to take the opportunity to make that little plug there for us, inviting persons to the NCOF next Friday.
All right, thank you very, very much. We look forward to that event. Any final closing remarks from anyone before I wrap us up?
Hi, Callum.
Hi, yes.
Hi, I just want to reiterate some of the points that was raised by Catherine and Dr. Rupner, especially with our team being disaster ready is my responsibility. Yes, there are a lot of high level plans, policies, programs that are happening at the national level, but it's just to reiterate that there are simple ways that we can mitigate, we can reduce our flood impacts, we can reduce our climate-induced impacts. So it's just to take the simple steps, look out for some of the discussions that we'll be having in subsequent webinars, some of the messaging that we'll be putting out via social media, especially from the NDPPMC page, but also with respect to the different agencies that are present in the webinar. So simple steps, big impact. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ms. Galston. Ms. Badaldurga?
Hi, yes. So thanks again for inviting us to be part of this webinar. It was really well, it was good. It was encouraging to see so many people turned out to be part of it. And I especially thank all the other co-hosts, co-panelists that were here. We really want to encourage this type of interactive way going forward. It's an integrated approach. If we could do something, even the public, it all starts with us. Remember, everything you do has an impact on everyone else. It's not you alone living in this world. So that little bit of garbage, please don't throw it in a water course. Don't throw it in a drain. It ends up in the sea. And we don't want to do that. So every little step begins with you. Every little bit matters. And this cooperative way that we are going forward will definitely make a change. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Mr. Kumar Singh, I note your hand is up.
Yeah, thank you very much. I wouldn't repeat anything that was said before, which I concur with, but ready to underscore from a sectoral and a policy perspective, given the nature of climate change and the hazards that it will pose and poses now and more to come, that we have to stop operating in silos. And true climate change policy has to be integrated, and climate risk assessment has to be integrated across all sectors, all ministries, all divisions, and all agencies, and at the community level as well. Otherwise, we continue perhaps doing things that may be in potential conflict with others. So I would have posted in the chat, for example, that when we design infrastructure, we must design infrastructure for 100+ years. Otherwise it becomes very, very expensive to maintain. But on that score, I just wanted to say that the Ministry of Planning will be soon working with these ministries, other ministries, divisions, and agencies to conduct training in the use of a climate assessment risk tool that we had developed with the Climate Change Center some years ago, so that they could begin to to understand the climate risks and begin to take ownership, real ownership of their remits by integrating these risks into their designs, into their strategies. And I want to congratulate the Drainage Division for taking the initiative to integrate the climate change considerations. But I think that there still needs to be a really working and comprehensive understanding of what these risks are and how they can be assessed and addressed in a sectoral and a cross-sectoral manner. Just to say that is a critical prerequisite for actually building real climate resilience towards long-term adaptation. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Kumar Singh. Now, before we close today, I'd just like to take this time to invite the CEO of the ODPM, Major General Retired Rodney Smart, to say a few words before we close. Major General?
Kelon, thank you very much. And I will be very brief, as you indicated. First, I want to say, wow, what a wonderful webinar this has been. You know, this is what I call a world-class webinar. Yes, we focus on Trinidad and Tobago, but the information that was shared could apply to any part of the globe. The information was rich. I want to say in fact, I'll start with you and say, Kelon, thank you very much for being a wonderful host, right? You hosted well, you kept everybody involved, you kept us engaged. I want to say thank you. I also want to say thank you, of course, to the presenters. As I indicated, the information shared could be presented any part, applied any part of the world. While we focus here on Trinidad and Tobago, the information was very rich. And certainly, I hope, as Camila said at the end there, that we take the information, do something. You know, information is really not effective if we just keep the information. So let us do something and start off with ourselves and our communities. But all of this happened because of an organization called the NDPPMC. And I've heard the importance of having this multi-sectoral grouping. We call it by different names. And I want to say thank you for the committee for bringing this together in the month when we're focusing our attention on preparing. Not that we're doing it only in the month, but we're doing it more so as we approach the wet season, as we approach the Atlantic hurricane season. So I want to say thank you to the committee. And of course, I must say thank you to the subcommittee, because there was a subcommittee of the bigger committee that would have put this on. My final thank you is to the attendees, the people who came on, who registered, who felt that this was important enough to listen to the information that was being shared. I hope it enrich you. I hope it empower you. I hope it brings about change and allow you to make your own contributions. And in fact, I would say continue, because I'm sure that the persons who were online today were people who are already involved. And let us recruit others, because this is a very important thing for our country, decades and eons into the future. So thank you very much, everyone, for what we were able to achieve today. And I would want to suggest, Kelon, that this, as you indicated, we make sure and put this up on YouTube and any other channel, so that the world gets the benefit of these 3 hours that we spent, well, just about together. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you so much, Major General. And with that, I thank you all one last time for your time and attention. And I would like to invite everyone to look out for other events as part of this National Disaster Prevention and Preparedness Month that we're engaged in. If you look on your screens right now, you should all be seeing our calendar. I know it might be a bit small on your screens, but I invite everyone to go to the ODPM's webpage, where you can see the full calendar and descriptions for all of the events coming up. We're on Friday, 5th May, so we're rounding out week 1. And tomorrow, you can see us in Bamboo at the Bamboo Government Primary School. And of course, we're advertising all of these events on our social media pages, so please be on the lookout for them and see which of them you can attend. Some are in person, some are online. So we invite the public to keep an eye out and, of course, attend and participate. Thank you all for your time and attention today, and I wish you an enjoyable rest of your day. Everyone, panelists, thank you again to all of you for your willingness to share this information with us. It has been truly illuminating. Thank you and take care, everyone.
All the best as well to you, Kelon, and the team.
Thank you.